right. Good morning to all of you. Where are you guys all from? Just everywhere. All of you are from Ohio, though, right?
Yeah.
So what town?
Akron, Columbus.
Akron, Columbus, Dayton. Where?
Fort Lauderdale.
Fort Lauderdale. Okay. Anybody from Marietta? But you went there yesterday, right? Okay. Well, I grew up in Marietta, so I have a special affinity, I guess, for that place, and it's partly the reason I got interested in Ohio history. As Becky said, I also teach at Miami University, which is probably the most difficult place in the state to get to from one place to the other. It's almost in Indiana, if you guys know where it is. So no matter where I go in Ohio, it seems like I have to drive at least 2 hours to get there. So most of you are what level grades then? High school, middle school? High school. All right, so you've taken some history, I assume, at some point. No? Yes? All right. And if you have, you're probably just dying for me to start talking about more history at this point on a nice cold morning in Edina, Ohio. My job this morning is to talk to you about the way in which government in particular had a role in the development of what became the state of Ohio. And what I'm going to do is try and set up a problem for you and talk about what the issues were and give you a little bit of background on it. And then we'll take a little bit of a break and come back and look more specifically at how the Ohio government got set up and how it got developed in the late 18th and early 19th century. Now, let me start out with just a few pieces of information. I'm going to assume that your background on this is not detailed, although some of you may know more about it than I do. But at this point, I think for the basic way to approach this is to assume that we're starting out with not a lot of knowledge at all. Ohio, as you probably know, became a state in 1803. Now, this date is significant for a lot of reasons, but one of the things I want to emphasize today is how quickly or how much the formation of Ohio came out of the American Revolution. The American Revolution began in what year? Does anybody know? If I said, what year did the American Revolution start? Does anybody know when I'm talking about?
1775.
1775, very good. Most people say 1776 because they associate it with the Declaration of Independence, but the war breaks out. Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts in 75. It ends in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris ends the revolution and the United States becomes a free and independent country. George III, the king, actually mounts his throne in front of the ambassador of the United States, John Adams, and says, I, George III, by the grace of God, king, etc., 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 do hereby recognize that these states are of right, free, independent, and sovereign. All right, during the American Revolution, the United States was governed by what we might call the first Constitution of the United States, the Articles of Confederation. Now, when the Americans began the American Revolution, they had no idea in 1775, 76, maybe a few of them, but the vast majority didn't, that they were going to create a great country, a big, huge Republican empire, or what Jefferson called an empire of liberty. By empire, he meant a great country that stood for liberty. Really, all they were thinking about was escaping Great Britain and what they saw as British tyranny. So they formed a government that was really designed to do nothing more than win the war and help them set up their own country. Nobody was really thinking very much about what would happen after the war was over. And that's part of what Ohio is all about. And the problem that Ohio is part of the solution to is exactly what was a Republican government and how did it function. Now, by Republican, I'm not talking about George Bush. I'm talking about the idea of a republic with a small r. And here, the first thing I need to emphasize to you is when you think about what a Republican government was, or what a republic was. You've got to remember how revolutionary, radical, and extraordinary this idea was in the late 18th century. Up to this point in the history of Western Europe and North America, government had been about monarchy, had been about kings and queens. It had been about people born to power, telling everybody else, basically, in theory at least, how to live their lives. There had been no real notion that power came from the people and went to the top. Instead, kings became kings. Why? Because their father was king. And because they had what was called divine right, which you probably learned about in school. That God had ordained them to become the leader of a particular country. Like Queen Elizabeth today is Queen of England, not because she's the smartest, most talented person, not because she was elected, but because her father was king. And she's the oldest child, no sons, so therefore the oldest daughter, becomes queen. When she dies, her son Charles will become king. For no other reason than that he is her son. And he will then have power. Now today in the 21st century, most kings who are left and queens don't have a lot of power, or at least don't exercise much of the power. But in 1775, 1776, kings or monarchy was the way that most government operated. And in theory then, government operated from the top down. Governments existed or got what we call their legitimacy. And by legitimacy, what I mean is widespread acceptance that they were the legitimate power. The idea, for example, that most of us pay our taxes, vote, assume that our government is on some level at least fair and responsive. Now, that varies from day to day and issue to issue, but the sense that the government is legitimate, that it has a right to exist and a right to do what it does. Legitimacy before 1776 then came from this divine right of monarchies. And governments enforced their legitimacy or their power in all kinds of ways. Through military power. Through the subjection or subjugation of people. Through terror, punishment, prison, putting people in stocks, beating them, executing them, cutting their heads off, the kind of thing you see in movies, with Mary Queen of Scots and Henry VIII and all that kind of stuff, where the king just says, I want to get rid of this person. And so the person is executed. There are no such things as political parties. There is no such thing as dissent. The idea is that the king is all-powerful. And the king rules then because he has a right and obtains his legitimacy from God and enforces it basically through the execution, terror, through religion to some extent. The idea that you're subordinate because God wills you to be subordinate to people. And the idea then is that power comes from the top down. Now, the American Revolution between 1775 and 1783 was part of what historians refer to as a larger period called the Age of the Democratic Revolution. And what happened throughout Western Europe and in the Americas between roughly the 1760s and the 1820s were a series of revolutions all over what we call the Atlantic world. North America, Western Europe, Spain, Latin America, and other parts of the world, in which, for all kinds of reasons that we don't have time to go in today, a large number of people said, we don't consider a monarchy a legitimate form of government anymore. We no longer accept the idea that just because some guy is born to power, that we have to do what he tells us to do. We reject the idea that he should be allowed to terrorize people. We should reject the idea that he should be allowed to order us to do whatever it is that he thinks he wants us to do. And we revolt against that, rebel against that, refuse to accept the legitimacy of that government anymore. That's what happened in April 1775 at Concord and Lexington, Massachusetts.